Imagine waking up tomorrow, not in your apartment, not in your house, but inside a massive stone castle with cold air pressing through the windows and torches still burning from the night before. Outside your bedroom, thousands of people are waiting. Farmers, soldiers, priests, merchants, servants who have not eaten yet because you have not decided if they can, because starting today, you are not just a person anymore, you are a king, and every single decision you make in the next 24 hours will decide whether your kingdom survives the year or quietly starts to fall apart. This is not a story about castles and crowns. This is a story about money, because behind every medieval kingdom, behind every war, every wedding, every cathedral, and every famine, there was one brutal question that never went away. Can you afford this? Most people imagine kings as men who simply pointed at things and got them. Gold appeared, armies appeared, castles rose out of nowhere. But the truth is far more terrifying. A medieval kingdom was one of the most expensive, most fragile operations a human being could ever run. It had no safety net, no bailout, no insurance. If you made the wrong call, people did not just lose money, they starved. So let's find out what it actually costs to own one. Let's start with the crown itself. Becoming king was never the finish line. It was the starting gun. The moment that crown touched your head, you inherited every debt your predecessor left behind, every enemy who was waiting for a weak successor, and every promise made to nobles who expected to be repaid in land, gold, or blood. You did not inherit a kingdom. You inherited a business with thousands of employees, no salary structure, and a war happening somewhere on the payroll. And the very first expense waiting for you was staring you in the face every single morning. Your castle. A stone castle was not a home. It was a machine built to keep you alive. Building one could take 10 to 20 years and consume the labor of thousands of workers, stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers who needed to be fed, housed, and paid in an era with no trucks, no cranes, and no shortcuts. Every single stone had to be quarried by hand, dragged for miles, and lifted using nothing but wood, rope, and human muscle. Historians estimate that some of the largest medieval castles cost the modern equivalent of tens of millions of dollars to construct, not because stone was expensive, because time was expensive, and time meant wages, meant food, meant risk. And once it was built, the spending never stopped. Castles needed constant repair. Walls cracked, roofs leaked, wood rotted. Every year, a percentage of your treasury simply vanished into maintenance, the medieval version of a mortgage that never ends. But here's the twist: nobody tells you. The castle wasn't really about comfort. It was about fear. A strong castle told rival kings, rebellious nobles, and invading armies one simple message: attacking you would cost more than it was worth. In medieval economics, your castle was not a house. It was a warning sign built out of stone. But a warning sign does nothing if your people are starving behind it. Because before taxes, before armies, before trade, a king had one job that came before everything else: feed the population. This sounds simple until you realize how terrifyingly fragile medieval food supply actually was. There were no refrigerators, no supermarkets, no emergency food shipments from another country. If your harvest failed, there was no plan B. A single bad summer, too much rain, too little sun, or one wave of crop disease could wipe out enough grain to starve entire regions by winter. This is why farming wasn't just a job in the Middle Ages. It was the entire economy. Nearly 90% of the population worked the land in some form, not because people loved farming, but because everything else in the kingdom depended on whether the harvest survived. Soldiers needed grain. Blacksmiths needed grain. Merchants needed grain to trade. Even you, the king, needed grain, because a hungry kingdom does not stay loyal for long. So how did you pay for all of this? Simple. You taxed the very people who were feeding you. Taxation, in the Middle Ages, was not a form you filled out once a year. It was land taxes, harvest taxes, market taxes, road taxes, and religious taxes called tithes, all stacked on top of each other, squeezing every level of society at once. But here's the part that made kingship so dangerous. Tax too little, and you could not pay your soldiers, maintain your castle, or defend your borders. Tax too much, and you risked something far worse than bankruptcy. You risked rebellion. History is full of kings who pushed taxation too far and watched their own people rise up against them because starving peasants with nothing left to lose become the most dangerous force in any kingdom. So taxation wasn't just an economic decision. It was a survival calculation, one wrong move away from chaos. And once that tax gold came in, you needed somewhere to actually spend it. This is where roads and markets came in, and they mattered more than most people realize. A kingdom without roads was a kingdom that could not move food, soldiers, or trade goods fast enough to survive a crisis. Good roads meant grain could reach a starving town before it was too late. They meant soldiers could reach a border before an enemy army did. They meant merchants could reach your markets and pay you taxes on every single transaction. And markets themselves were economic engines hiding in plain sight. Every town square, buzzing with traders, was not just commerce, it was tax revenue, multiplied every single market day. Blacksmiths hammered out tools that let farmers work faster and soldiers fight better. Merchants connected your kingdom to goods you could never produce yourself. Spices, silk, dyes, salt, and weapons technology from distant lands. And beyond your borders, trade routes stretched further than most people imagine, connecting medieval Europe to the Middle East, to Africa, to Asia, through danger, distance, and enormous risk. If your kingdom had access to a major trade route or a working port, you were sitting on something close to modern-day oil. Ports meant taxable goods, flowing in and out constantly. They meant access to foreign markets. They meant your kingdom could become wealthy not just from what it produced, but from what simply passed through it. This is why coastal kingdoms often grew richer, faster than landlocked ones. Because in medieval economics, location was not just geography, it was destiny. Think about what a single trade route actually represented. A caravan crossing hundreds of miles, carrying silk from the east, spices from distant coasts, or fine cloth from a rival kingdom was not just a business transaction. It was a chain of risk stretched across an entire continent. Bandits could strike at any point along the way. Storms could sink an entire cargo of goods in one bad night at sea. A single disrupted route could mean empty market stalls and furious merchants back home. This is why smart kings didn't just protect their own castle walls. They protected the roads, the bridges, and the routes leading into their kingdom, because every mile of safe infrastructure was another mile of guaranteed tax revenue. Infrastructure, in other words, was not decoration. It was investment. A well-maintained bridge could mean the difference between a merchant choosing your kingdom or your rivals. A well-guarded road could mean the difference between grain arriving in time to prevent a famine or arriving 3 weeks too late to matter. This is the part of medieval economics that rarely gets discussed in movies and legends. The kings who built lasting prosperity weren't always the ones who won the most battles. They were the ones who understood that spending gold today on roads, bridges, and safe passage could multiply into far greater wealth tomorrow. Economic growth in a medieval kingdom didn't happen by accident. It happened because someone, somewhere, made the unglamorous decision to invest in the boring things. The roads nobody praised, the bridges nobody celebrated, the systems that quietly kept everything else functioning. But wealth needed one more thing to actually function: money itself. Coinage might be the most underrated economic weapon a medieval king possessed. By minting your own coins, stamped with your face and your authority, you controlled trust itself. Merchants needed to believe that gold and silver coins actually held the value they claimed. But this power came with a dangerous temptation. If you needed cash fast, whether for a war, a famine, or a failed harvest, some kings secretly reduced the amount of real silver or gold in their coins, stretching the same amount of metal into more coins. This felt like free money. It was actually a trap, because when people realized their coins were worth less than before, prices for everything skyrocketed. Bread that cost 1 coin yesterday suddenly cost 3 coins today. This was medieval inflation, and unlike modern economies, there was no central bank, no safety mechanism, and no way to soften the blow. Inflation didn't just raise prices, it quietly destroyed trust in the king himself. And trust in a medieval kingdom was worth more than gold. Now let's talk about the single most expensive line item in your entire kingdom: your army. Feeding, arming, training, and paying soldiers was almost always the largest expense a king ever faced, often consuming more than half of total royal spending in any given year. Knights alone were staggeringly expensive. Full-plate armor, war horses bred and trained specifically for battle, weapons, and support staff could cost the modern equivalent of a small fortune per knight per year. Now imagine paying for hundreds of them. This is why medieval wars were never fought lightly. A single military campaign could drain years of tax revenue in a matter of months. Soldiers needed to be paid even when they weren't fighting, because unpaid soldiers had a nasty habit of turning against the very king they were hired to protect. And war brought risks far beyond the battlefield. Because war meant fewer farmers working the fields. Fewer farmers meant less food. Less food meant rising prices, hungry citizens, and a kingdom growing more unstable by the week. This is the brutal truth most people never consider. War didn't just cost gold, it cost the entire economy, quietly, in the background, long after the battle ended. So why did kings fight wars at all if they were this expensive? Because sometimes diplomacy failed. Royal marriages, alliances, and treaties were not romantic gestures. They were economic strategy, designed to avoid the catastrophic cost of war by binding two kingdoms together through family ties instead of bloodshed. A single royal wedding could prevent decades of expensive conflict. But when diplomacy collapsed, war became the only option left, expensive, terrifying, and absolutely unavoidable. And religion played its own quiet role in this entire system. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was one of the wealthiest, most powerful economic forces in the medieval world, collecting tithes, owning enormous amounts of land, and often holding more influence over the population than the king himself. Smart kings understood this. They didn't fight the church. They partnered with it because losing the church's support could turn an entire population against you overnight. But even the smartest king, with the strongest army and the wealthiest church alliance, could not control everything. Because the greatest threats to a medieval kingdom were never other kings. They were forces no army could fight. Plague was the ultimate economic disaster. When disease swept through a kingdom, it didn't just kill people, it collapsed the entire economic engine at once. Farmers died, leaving fields unplanted. Blacksmiths died, leaving tools unmade. Merchants died, leaving trade routes empty. The Black Death alone wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population in just a few years, an economic shockwave so severe that some regions took over a century to fully recover. And once plague passed, famine often followed. because fewer farmers meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant food shortages, and food shortages meant rising anger among a population that had already lost everything. This is the point where kingdoms became dangerously fragile, because a hungry, grieving population does not stay patient. Rebellions rarely began as random chaos. They began as economic breaking points, moments where taxation, famine, war, and inequality collided until people had absolutely nothing left to lose, and a rebellion, once it started, was almost impossible to stop cheaply. You needed soldiers to control it. Soldiers needed gold. Gold that likely didn't exist anymore because you had already spent it on the war, the castle, the famine relief, and the royal family sitting comfortably behind palace walls. Because yes, your family had expenses too: feasts, clothing, servants, education, and status symbols meant to prove to other kingdoms that you were strong, stable, and worth respecting. But every gold coin spent on royal luxury was a coin not spent on soldiers, roads, or grain reserves. This is the impossible balancing act every king faced. Spend too little on your image, and other kingdoms saw weakness. Spend too much, and your own people saw greed. So what actually made a kingdom rich? Not gold sitting in a treasury. Movement. Wealthy kingdoms were the ones where farming, trade, taxation, infrastructure, and military spending all worked together like a functioning machine, where money kept moving instead of sitting still. Roads that let goods flow, markets that let merchants thrive, fair taxation that funded the kingdom without crushing the people paying for it. Strong diplomacy that avoided unnecessary wars, and enough military strength to make invasion too expensive for anyone to attempt. This is what created prosperity, not luck, balance, and what destroyed kingdoms almost never happened in a single moment. It happened slowly, quietly, one bad decision compounding on another, overspending on wars, overtaxing desperate citizens, ignoring famine warnings, debasing coins for short-term cash, trusting the wrong advisors, underestimating a rebellion until it was already at the castle gates. Bankruptcy rarely announced itself. It crept in, disguised as a temporary solution. A king who could not pay his soldiers eventually lost his army. A king who could not feed his people eventually lost his throne. And a king who forgot that his entire kingdom was one interconnected economic system eventually lost everything at once. Look closely at history, and you will notice something strange. The kingdoms that collapsed almost never fell because of one single catastrophe. A famine alone rarely destroyed a kingdom. A war alone rarely destroyed a kingdom. Even a plague alone, as devastating as it was, rarely destroyed a kingdom completely. What destroyed kingdoms was the pile-up, a war that drained the treasury, followed by a bad harvest that drained the food supply, followed by a tax increase that drained the people's patience, all landing within the same few years, with no time to recover in between. This is the hidden lesson buried inside medieval economics. A strong kingdom wasn't one that avoided every disaster. That was impossible. A strong kingdom was one that built enough reserves, enough trust, and enough infrastructure to absorb one crisis without immediately triggering the next. The kingdoms that survived centuries were rarely the richest ones at their peak. They were the ones that planned for the moment things went wrong, because in the Middle Ages, something always eventually went wrong. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. Knowing everything you now know, the taxes, the wars, the famines, the debts, the constant balancing act between spending and survival, could you actually afford to be a medieval king? Could your kingdom survive under your leadership? Or would it slowly, quietly collapse under the weight of decisions you never fully understood? Because here is the truth this entire story has been building toward. Ruling a medieval kingdom was never really about crowns, castles, or gold. It was about responsibility, disguised as luxury. Every tax collected, every road built, every war fought, every alliance formed, existed for one single purpose: keeping an entire civilization alive. And that responsibility never really disappeared. It simply changed shape. Because today, we don't call it a kingdom anymore. We call it a government, a company, a city, a family. But the same brutal questions remain. Can you protect the people who depend on you? Can you build something strong enough to survive hardship? Can you grow prosperity instead of just chasing wealth? Because true wealth was never just gold sitting in a treasury. It was the ability to protect people, sustain a community, and keep something bigger than yourself alive for one more generation. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson a medieval kingdom can teach us today. Because whether you're ruling a castle or simply trying to build a life that lasts, the real question was never how much you could gain. It was always how much you were willing to protect.